Well, thank you for the warm reception. It's great to have so many people coming up and sharing with me the work that they're doing and the fact that they follow our work, and to receive me so nicely here and warmly. I have to be honest with you. I'm accustomed to speaking in a hall like this at the United Nations Human Rights Council, and so I am accustomed to a very different kind of reception. But nevertheless, I'm happy to make the adjustment. It's great to be here in Frankfurt. Thank you. It's great to be here in Frankfurt, Germany, at the 5th Deutscher Israelkongress. And we meet today in 2018, where we just marked several months ago the 70th anniversary of the creation of the State of Israel. And very soon, in a few weeks, we're going to have another momentous anniversary, the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in Paris by the United Nations General Assembly on 10 December 1948. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights became a beacon over time for human rights activists. It sets forth the rights and freedoms that we all hold dear: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. And of course, the founders of that Universal Declaration, the architects of that Universal Declaration, were the great founders of the United Nations Human Rights Commission back in 1946. And I mean Eleanor Roosevelt, the founding chair of the UN Human Rights Commission, and René Cassin, the vice chair and someone who is credited as being the architect himself of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And thanks to those eminent idealists, we have this important document that we will celebrate on 10th of December. And you know, many people today, if you go at the United Nations and you go to the Human Rights Council, as it's known today, and if you would ask them about Eleanor Roosevelt, and if you would ask them about René Cassin, few would know that the founders of human rights at the United Nations were great supporters of Israel. Eleanor Roosevelt, in the 1940s, late 40s, and the 1950s, she would be crisscrossing America, going from one event, Israel Bonds, Hadassah Women, Jewish federations across America, speaking out for Israel, for Israel's needs to take in hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Middle Eastern countries and other places. And she would be writing letters to President Eisenhower saying that young Israel needs arms to defend itself from its Arab neighbors who repeatedly attacked Israel. And in the early 1960s, when the United Nations began to turn against Israel, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most distinguished UN figures, whose photo appears on all the UN websites, she criticized the UN. She said, when the UN is singling out Israel for defending itself in the north against Syrian shelling, and the UN began to condemn Israel, Eleanor Roosevelt criticized the UN because the UN was not living up to its principles. And René Cassin, the great French legal philosopher in the Six-Day War, he was writing editorials, articles in Le Monde defending Israel's right to defend itself during the Six-Day War when Jordan began to attack Jerusalem. And Israel's very existence was at stake. He defended Israel's right to defend itself. And when a year later, in 1968, when they celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Tehran, this was then under the Shah, there was an international UN conference. And when that UN conference began to reflect the new majority at the UN, the alliance between the Soviet Union and countries from Africa and Asia who began to turn against Israel from the so-called non-aligned movement, René Cassin saw Israel becoming the new scapegoat at the United Nations in the very topic that he created, the subject of human rights. He saw how that was being hijacked, turned against Israel, and eventually he walked out. René Cassin walked out and he took a bold stand. And so I wonder today, on the eve of this anniversary, what would Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin think if they were alive today and they saw what happens at the United Nations' highest human rights body, the Human Rights Council, where I've been based for the past 14 years. If they were alive and they came and they saw the members, who today, the members of the UN's highest human rights body, are not eminent idealists like Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin and P.C. Chang and Charles Malik and John Humphrey, who were the founders back in the 40s, but rather the members today of the Human Rights Council, something you may not always read about in your newspapers, include China, Cuba, Venezuela, Qatar, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Eritrea they just elected, and the list goes on. Many of the world's worst dictatorships are members of the UN's highest human rights body. And I ask, what would Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin think if they were alive today to see what happens at that Human Rights Council, which meets 3 times a year in September, March, and June? When they would see, what would they think when they would see that some of the worst abusers, like Saudi Arabia, which is a member of the Council, has never had a single condemnation against it, not a single resolution, even as it subjugates women. And we know that the Crown Prince announced that women could drive, but then with the other hand, he arrested the leading women's rights activists. They are getting electric shocks in prison, being tortured. 0 resolutions on Saudi abuses of women. And what would they think if they would see Turkey, which fired 100,000 people, teachers, university deans, throws journalists in prison? Turkey, not a single resolution, 0. And Cuba, which takes human rights activists and throws them in prison. Eduardo Carde is in prison now, one of the leading dissidents. We've filed a legal brief for him. And there have been 0 resolutions on Cuba. And 0 on Pakistan, where Pakistani Christian woman Asia Bibi sat for 8 years on death row because she was accused of blasphemy, because she drank water from some Muslims in her village, and they accused her of blasphemy. And in Pakistan, if you get accused of blasphemy, you find yourself on death row. And she was just released finally, but they won't let her leave the country, and the mob wants to kill her. 0 resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council. And then, of course, China, which includes 1/5 of the world's population, 1.3 billion people, denied freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Not a single resolution ever on 1.3 billion human rights victims. And what would the founders of the UN human rights system think if they would see the experts of the Human Rights Council, which include people like Hillel Neuer, who is the expert on hunger and yet has never done anything for the hungry people of Venezuela, millions of people who are struggling to find food, who have to go through garbage bags to find food. And she's the expert on hunger. And if anything, when she tweets about it the few times, she said, but it's not the government's fault, it's the opposition's fault. That's Hillel Neuer at the Human Rights Council. And what would they think of UN human rights expert Jean Ziegler, who in the year 1989 created the Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize? I will say that again. The Muammar Gaddafi Human Rights Prize was co-founded. The spokesman to the world was Jean Ziegler. He was quoted in the Journal de Genève and Time magazine, in The Independent. Very proud of it. And in the year 2002, in the same year that the prize went to convicted French Holocaust denier Roger Garaudy, Jean Ziegler himself won the prize. And he is the longest-serving UN Human Rights Council expert. He's been there for 18 years. They can't get rid of him because the dictators love him. And what would Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin think when they came to this council and they saw the worst abusers ignored, but instead they saw one single country, the country whose rights to equal treatment, to existence, they defended, the State of Israel, singled out in a way that no other country is singled out. And I'll mention briefly 5 ways. Number 1, resolutions that condemn countries. In the first 10 years of the new and improved Human Rights Council, after the great reform of 2006, from 2006 to 2016, if you count all the resolutions on the rest of the world, the few that they've had on Syria or Iran or North Korea, the few that they've done, you get to 67 resolutions on the whole world combined. And if you count how many resolutions on the Jewish state, on Israel, 68. More resolutions on Israel than the rest of the world combined. And then when we begin our sessions in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council, there's 1 day for the world, item 4 on the agenda, human rights situations around the world, and 1 agenda item, 1 day for Israel alone, human rights violations in the occupied Arab territories, including Palestine. 1 agenda item, 1 day for the world, 193 countries, 1 agenda item every session, no matter what's happening. Israel could have just withdrawn from Gaza. uprooted 10,000 Jews living there. There's one day on Israel. There is no other country in the world that has its own day. If they do address North Korea, the others, it's on the general agenda item. There is not a special agenda item on North Korea. There is not one on Syria, 500,000 people killed. There is not one on Sudan, whose leader is wanted for genocide. Only on Israel. And then emergency sessions. There have been more emergency sessions against Israel than on anyone. There's never been one emergency session on Iran, even as earlier this year they slaughtered protesters in the streets who just wanted food and said, why are you sending our money, wasting it on terrorism in Gaza and Lebanon? What about feeding us? And people were killed. No emergency sessions on that. And I mentioned some of the experts, and I'll mention one other. There's an expert on Palestine. His name is Michael Link, and his job, the special rapporteur on Palestine, is to look only at Israel. That's in his mandate, to investigate, and I quote, Israel's violations, and therefore if there's a terrorist attack against Israelis, he will say nothing. So ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're up against at the Human Rights Council, and sadly we see in the UN General Assembly, and I want to speak to something that's happening in Germany today. In the UN General Assembly in New York, they are meeting now in the next few weeks, and each year they adopt 20 resolutions on Israel. In this year, we're going to have one on Syria, one on North Korea, one on Crimea, one on Myanmar. There was one condemning America for Cuba, and there's going to be 20 on Israel, like every year. And Germany, I'm sad to say, Germany, together with the other members of the European Union, will support 75% of these one-sided anti-Israel resolutions that single out the Jewish state. And we just saw last week there were 9 of them adopted in one day. Germany, with the other EU members, I'm not here to single out Germany, this is a EU-wide problem, but Germany needs to stand up to the plate. And Germany supported 8 of the 9, including a resolution condemning Israel for being on the Golan Heights for, quote, repressive measures against Syrian citizens. And this is a resolution co-sponsored, it says, co-sponsored by Syria. The genocidal Assad regime is sponsoring a resolution to condemn Israel for its repressive measures against Syrian citizens, and Germany, together with the EU countries, voted yes. And this came up, it was reported in Bild, and it came up in the parliament, in the Bundestag, and I commend those members of parliament who raised this issue. And your foreign minister, Heiko Maas, said, but you don't understand, he said, and I was just reading the protocols. You don't understand, we stay in the negotiation, we're part of it, we vote for these because we make sure that the language will not be too sharp. So because we're engaged, we make sure that we improve the language. We are helping Israel, is his message. We're voting against Israel 15 out of 20 times. When there's 1 on Iran, 20 on Israel, Germany supports 15 of those. They abstain on the other 5 to help Israel. Maybe Mr. Maas will help Israel more and support 100 resolutions against Israel. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is nonsense. This is nonsense. Germany should do what it would do with any other country if there were resolutions adopted on the worst regime in the world. If they adopted 20 resolutions on North Korea, Germany and the other EU countries would tell whichever sponsor, you're wasting our time. Do 1 resolution. You don't need 20. But we had 4 resolutions on UNRWA. There's going to be 2 on the Golan and another 15 or so on Palestinian violations by Israel, refugees. It is absurd, and it amounts to a demonization. It's an infrastructure of demonizations based at the United Nations General Assembly. It's time for Germany to act according to its principles. It's time for Germany to vote no. And the German foreign minister says, yeah, but we improved the language. We improved 3 words, you know. We don't need those 3 words to be improved. If that ever happened, I don't know. But Germany should vote no. And even if the resolution passes with the EU and Germany vote no, then the world sees that the leading democracies of the world have taken a stand. Now, finally, Finally, I ask, because we're speaking about human rights, it's not just the United Nations, and it's not just dictatorships, it's human rights organizations. It's what we call civil society, non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And I ask you, what would Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, who were deeply involved in the creation of what we know today as the international human rights movement, what would they think if they came alive today and they saw Amnesty International, the iconic human rights group, the largest human rights group in the world, doing events with radical Islamists in Brussels and elsewhere, but singling out Israel time and again in some of the worst ways? And what would they think if they saw Human Rights Watch, the leading human rights group in America, headed by a gentleman named Ken Roth, who on his Twitter every single day finds a reason to attack and defame Israel, no matter what is going on? And I'll just share with you a story. Earlier this year, I was invited to speak in London, and it was the Jewish community of London, a group called the Jewish Leadership Council. It includes 34 Jewish charities, synagogues, and other organizations. And this coalition invited me to speak, and we reserved the conference center of Amnesty International UK office. And 3 days before that I was supposed to speak in a debate with a gentleman from the UN Association of the United Kingdom, 4 days before, Amnesty canceled the event. They said, we cannot do an event with a group that supports the settlements. And they accused us, which it's an issue we don't talk about, but they claimed that the Jewish Leadership Council supports the settlements. Again, this is not a coalition or a group that talks about it, but in the end of the day, Amnesty International wouldn't do an event with the Jewish community of London. And to me, that is a dangerous moment when the leading human rights group says that we cancel an event because the sponsor is a group of 34 Jewish charities, even as I said, Amnesty will do events in Brussels, for example, with radical Islamists who are anti-gay and anti-Semitic. They have no problem doing it with them and saying, we don't agree with them on everything, but we agree with them on fighting Islamophobia. But at an event earlier this year with the Jewish community of London, they refused to do any event with them. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe when we speak about the challenges of human rights today in the world and at the United Nations, I think it's time that we ask our leaders. And here in Germany, I think it's time that we all ask Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and his government and we have a message to say that it's time that we stand up for the true principles of human rights at the United Nations, not those that are distorted by the dictatorships and their apologists. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we need to tell Heiko Maas and the German government and the others from the EU that if you truly care for women's rights, and if you truly care for minority rights, and you truly care for gay rights, you don't stand with the Palestinian Authority, which arrests those minorities, and you don't stand with Hamas. You stand with Israel. And we need to say to the German government and the EU leaders that if you care about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion and the rule of law, you don't stand with the Palestinian Authority, you don't stand with Hamas, you stand with Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, the struggle at the United Nations is very much like being in a dark assembly, but with your help, your support, your activism, your courage, your taking a stand, together we can light a candle and be a candle of truth at the United Nations and in the world. Thank you very much.